Thank you for joining us. Before I introduce the Senator formally, I'll turn it over to our community lead, Jenna Clowley, to welcome everyone and do a land acknowledgement. Over to you, Jenna.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for working with us as we went through a short delay, but we're glad to have you all here to have this important topic discussion. And a couple housekeeping things. When you're not speaking, when we are speaking, when we're doing this panel, please everybody be on mute. It allows us to just have this discussion and not be interrupted. We've also set up some security admin on this one just to make sure we have all the right people in here. So if at any time you see anyone behaving inappropriately, please feel free to message me or flag it, and we will remove them from the chat. We are committed that we have an open and clear space for us to have this important discussion today, and we need everyone's help in that. I'm also, as Vinod mentioned, honored to take you through a land acknowledgement today. I want to start today's webinar by acknowledging that Future of Good operates on the unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory of Ottawa, Ontario. The purpose of this land acknowledgement is to acknowledge, as a non-Indigenous settler, that this unsurrendered land speaks to the continued injustice and inequitable practices between Canada and the original peoples of this land. As a non-Indigenous settler, I recognize the history of colonialism and a need for change in settler colonial societies. I ask you to join me in reflection today on the privilege inherent in being a non-Indigenous settler. For instance, today as a non-Indigenous settler, many of us are able to walk a few steps to a tap and get ourselves water. And at the same time, over 60 Indigenous communities are living through this pandemic with a long-term drinking water advisory on their land. We have the privilege to connect to this webinar today on the internet using our personal computers or smartphones. And yet there are many people across the country who lack this utility, vital for a 21st century life. Many of them live in Indigenous communities where gaining reliable and affordable broadband access is a matter of cultural survival. This week, we mourned the loss of 22 lives in Nova Scotia, whose faces and names have been on national media, and we have been present to an ongoing RCMP investigation. We cannot forget, though, that there is no reliable estimate of the numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit LGBTQIA persons in Canada, and many have had no investigation of any kind. We must continue to make Indigenous issues Canadian issues and not forget our country's commitment to reconciliation, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, or the powerful work in bringing to light unconscious biases and ways of being and acting that keep settlers committing acts of injustice against the original peoples of this land daily, even while enduring a pandemic. Thank you so much for reflecting with me today. Vinod, I'll pass it back over to you. And just before I do, if you have any questions for the Senator, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I will be collecting them and we will present them at the end. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a great time.
Thank you, Jenna, for that thoughtful and reflective land acknowledgement. Let me formally introduce Senator Omidvar. My family immigrated to Canada from India when I was about 9 years old, and since the start of my career, I've been truly inspired by the Senator's leadership and work in migration, newcomers, and refugee resettlement. There's so much to say on that front, but let me keep it to our context. In April 2016, Senator Omidvar was appointed to the Senate of Canada as an independent senator representing Ontario. And among a number of roles, Senator Omidvar also served as deputy chair of the Special Senate Committee on the Charitable Sector. So here's why we're here. Canada's over 170,000 charities, nonprofits, and voluntary organizations, and their millions of volunteers and staff are playing a vital role in Canadian society, especially right now during the pandemic. The economic impact of the charitable sector cannot be understated. Charities and nonprofits contribute more than $150 billion to our economy each year, representing about 8% of our GDP. And what we often miss is that charities, nonprofits, and voluntary organizations are some of the most creative, innovative, and resilient organizations. As an immigrant, I can tell you, so much that we have in our communities today, we owe to this sector's ingenuity and leadership. In June 2019, the Canadian Senate released Catalyst for Change, a roadmap to a stronger charitable sector, a first of its kind report on the modernization agenda for nonprofits and charities, particularly in its relationship with the Government of Canada. With 42 recommendations in a range of areas, this synthesis is the extraordinary work of senators who engaged a range of frontline professionals, funders, executives, volunteers, and public servants in order to understand the opportunities and pain points facing the sector. It's really only been about 9 months since the report was released, but it feels like the world has changed. Our institutions, our front lines, our funding mechanisms, service delivery, and advocacy will not be the same. So what does this mean for the recommendations and the report? Which recommendations could have a higher priority now, given what we know about the sector's role in relief and recovery? And what should we, the sector, be learning from this crisis? These are the types of questions the Senator and I will discuss over the next 20 to 30 minutes. We'll curate some Q&A at the end of our conversation, but please, as Jenna said, keep the questions coming. If it pertains to a point the Senator is making, we may take them right away. Another friendly reminder, please mute your microphone throughout this webinar, and let's get started. Senator, let's start with this. Tell us a little bit about the Special Senate Committee on the Charitable Sector. What was the question it set out to answer?
The Special Committee on the Charitable Sector was set out to, for the first ever look by either the House of Commons or by the Senate, and I was frankly surprised by this, that in the long years of parliamentary activities and studies, that the sector had never been looked at as a whole before. So for sure, there have been commissions and studies on, for example, the Voluntary Sector Initiative, the Blue Ribbon Task Force, and grants and contributions, but never has the sector been looked at as a whole. So our job was to take a look at the charitable and not-for-profit sector, review the way it functions, the way the federal government relates with the sector, the way the sector relates to itself, and to come up with a series of recommendations that would bring us into the modern day. And I use that term advisedly because modern times are, it depends on your lens, how you define them. But what's interesting is that the charitable sector seems mired in the Victorian era because of a lack of attention. We called it benign neglect in the report. And because of this benign neglect, it has been left unattended to, ignored for the most part. I will share with you, I was frustrated that the report itself, even though it received great feedback from the sector that is, I imagine, gathered around this room that you have convened, Vinod, the media had no interest in it. That's partly because, there don't seem to be any votes in charity and not-for-profit. That may have in fact shifted a little over the crisis. So I'm going to try and bridge to your next question, which will not be focused so much on I think what the report said, but why its recommendations have even greater vibrancy in the context of a crisis.
Right, exactly. And as you said, that Canadian society has significantly changed, and it feels like a lot has been revealed about our essential needs, from access to the internet to income security and a range of others. How do you feel about the relevance of the report right now in the relief phase of this crisis?
Well, I think I looked at the report again about 2 or 3 days ago and said, let me bring a lens of the crisis on this. And I was actually stunned, and maybe I'm biased because I was the vice chair of the task force. I was stunned by how prescient the report actually is, even in today's context. So let me give you an example. We urged the government. Now, mind you, because of the timing of all of this, the report has actually in parliamentary procedure not been approved by the Senate. It has not been sent to the government for response, which is what would normally happen. So we're operating in a bit of a vacuum. But the report said the sector needs a home in government, a home that would enable it to relate to different departments, where a home in government would create an interlocutor to connect its interests in policy and legislation and services across the whole of government. And guess what, Vinod? In a sense, during the crisis, this is what the government has been doing. The home in government for the sector has become the Crisis Management Committee. And if you review the actions of the government, they have been incrementally accommodating and aware of the role of the sector in helping Canada and Canadians overcome and renew themselves after the crisis. So for the first time, the sector has been equated with small business. Now, those, and one of the things I'd like to mention to the room is that my entire career has actually only ever been in Canada in the not-for-profit and charitable sector. So I feel I have the authenticity to say that this equation of charities and not-for-profits with small business is a very, very, very positive understanding, and one that we should applaud the stakeholders for, in particular Imagine Canada, for elevating the pitch to the point that when the government makes a decision about small business, let's say the rent stabilization fund, it now automatically says, and this will also apply to charities and not-for-profits. That's a huge win for the sector. It took a crisis to do that. But I'm also pragmatic enough to say, let's not let a crisis go to waste. And this crisis has actually propelled charities and not-for-profits and social impact organizations to the front as solution seekers and solution deliverers, which is what we've been arguing for years.
Right, and between, I want to sort of talk a little bit about the recovery of the sector. Between the mental health of frontline workers, switching to digital service delivery, layoffs that the sector has experienced. There's been a lot of changes in a short period of time. I remember this recommendation that you just spoke about around a home for the sector. I remember you spoke about it at the Philanthropic Foundation's conference in October last year. Are there recommendations that you perhaps didn't think of as high priority before the pandemic? There's 42 recommendations that would make a lot of sense for us to get behind for a faster recovery for the sector. And I'll give you, one that's on my mind right now is, given the layoffs in the sector, one of the recommendations is to implement a human resources renewal plan to ensure the long-term sustainability of the sector workforce. Given the layoffs, is this something that we should prioritize? What do you think?
I certainly think that the human resources renewal plan that we called for, I'm remembering the discussions, was in light of what we heard from witnesses around the prevalence of precarious work in the sector, and the lack of human resource capacity in the sector. Many not-for-profits and charities do not actually have an HR department. They need sort of a backbone institute, and we felt this was best located as sort of a shared service platform somewhere in the back end of some technology. I'm a Luddite, as you have already experienced today. But I think what has sharpened this recommendation is the fact that the recovery will not get started and will certainly not succeed without a vibrant service sector on both sides of government. And you need people. You need people to do this. And I'm actually worried that, notwithstanding all the support that the government has rolled out, the wage subsidies, et cetera, I continue to hear about layoffs in the sector. And so I am worried about those who will not be able to gear up again. And I think what I would maybe in the light of the crisis, maybe provide a nuanced difference to the recommendation we made, is that we should have a human resources renewal plan in the context of the crisis, and say, what do we have to do during and after the crisis to get the sector up to speed again? Because having people work in the sector through wage subsidies is one important issue. Keeping a roof over your head with the sector resilience, with the rent stabilization program is another good thing. But we know that there are many other charities and not-for-profits who fall through the cracks. And I'm worried about those. I should say that the other recommendation, which has really been brought into a sharp focus for me, is the legislative and administrative provisions that prevent charities from working in a meaningful shared in a meaningful partnership with organizations that are not charities. So, you know, there is, for the CRA junkies in the room, there is this regulation and statute that says that charities may not work with non-qualified donors.
Right.
Imagine what that says to charities who are working with indigenous communities who are not charitable. And so there cannot be a partnership of equality in it, because you can construct archaic agency agreements, and you can find weird ways of, and I've been in the sector, so I know what I'm talking about. The legal effort required to create agency agreements is, you know, I think the people in the room know what I'm talking about. We need to modernize that relationship. We need to accept and understand that in today's world of empowerment and equality and all those good principles and equity that we speak about are actually not reflected in the laws of the Ministry of Finance and the guidelines that the CRA administers those laws through. So it's overly constraining, and it speaks not just to the work charities are doing in Canada, but also in particular to the work charities are doing overseas. Unlike the UK, the US, Australia, and all others who have modernized their laws, we have not. We take a paternalistic, top-down approach that if you are going to work with me, and I'm talking about an organization or a civil society movement that is not charitable, then I control everything. So it's a very, you know, the land recognition that Jana read out reminded me about how colonial our income tax laws are as they relate to charities, and those must be changed. And I have called on the Minister of Finance in the short term to lift that requirement entirely. I have not received a response from him. I would urge others in the room to urge him to do the same. It's always much better when a crowd of people ask for something than one person. And I am also working in the long term on correcting this, what I would say, this anachronistic legislation.
Right, and the other thing that I'm noticing as well a fair bit is the way we purchase, the way we buy is also changing in a big way, both civil society as well as governments. And I know recently you spoke at the Buy Social Canada Digital Symposium, and one of the recommendations is really about the procurement strategy and how that can be further modified to remove the barriers to the participation of charitable and nonprofit organizations. Given the pandemic and given the recovery efforts that will be required, what are your thoughts around procurement?
I think that's actually one of the most underutilized levers of change in our system. When you talk about the recovery, this country is going to be purchasing services and goods in a way that we may not have seen. The economy needs to restart. We've already heard Minister McKenna say that she is looking for shovel-ready projects, which will be largely local in nature. She's talked about, you know, refurbishing hockey rinks and libraries. This is a unique opportunity to change the lens of the government, not just in creating jobs through procurement, but in ensuring that these jobs are shared with the community where the work is being done, with young people who may be unemployed, with minorities who may be unemployed, with people who've been laid off, who are you know, not young anymore, but not seniors anymore either, not yet. So I think this is a marvelous opportunity to gear up and to make sure that the language of social procurement and the language of community benefits is embedded into these major purchases that the government will be undertaking. And you know, I think this is completely doable. And if the sector is looking for readiness for getting back to normal, this should be one of the ideas it takes to heart and says, the government is going to be dumping billions, not dumping, I shouldn't use that word, will be spending billions of dollars in restarting our economy. I heard the mayor of Victoria on that panel say something that really struck with me, stayed with me. And that is that the city of Victoria has noticed that its financial procurement officers have transformed into agents of social change. And I thought that was, yes, that's how you do it. You take an idea and you embed it into existing processes. And so you change the processes so that there is another view at looking at how the money is spent and how you roll up the benefits. Not just through, we built a library, we planted 5 trees, we had a bench, we built a library, we employed so many people who were local, we provided business opportunities for so many startup businesses who were owned by women, let's say. So these are the ways we need to shift our thinking. And again, let's not let a crisis go to waste, folks. Let's use it.
Super. We have a question that I want to sort of, it pertains to something that that you just spoke about. Senator, would you talk about share an example of a law in Canada that is not modernized?
Okay, well, let me just start with the mother of all laws, the Income Tax Act. The Income Tax Act, as it pertains to charities, has not been reviewed for 50 years. 50 years. So we are still stuck, unlike other common law jurisdictions that we align ourselves to. We are still stuck in an Elizabethan mode. Our definitions of charity are paternalistic. Let me put it that way. So one outcome of that is the prevention of poverty. No, sorry, the relief of poverty is charitable, but the prevention of poverty is not. So an organization can help poor people with their immediate needs when they're poor, but to help people remove themselves out of poverty is apparently not. Now, this must be this must strike all sensible people as something that needs to be reviewed. Another example is you know, for instance, the fact that charities are not allowed to generate revenue unless it's through activities that are directly related to their charitable purpose. So museums can have museum shops, and hospitals can have gift shops. But technically, a charity cannot become a landlord, and many charities are landlords, and charities definitely cannot become developers, although some charities are functioning as developers. So there's a lot of cleanup to be done. There's a lot of changes we need to make, not just in how the sector is run or regulated, but also how it governs itself. One of my most favorite recommendations is that whilst the sector uses all the right words, And here's to you, you guys are the sector. There's no way of actually understanding at this point whether your governance is as diverse as the country is. Because we don't ask those questions. We don't ask in the income tax return that charities and not-for-profits file. Give us a sense of the demographics of your governance as per employment equity regulations. We ask that of corporations, by the way, but we don't ask that of charities. So we talk a good line, we're diverse, we serve underrepresented people, etc. But my research tells me that the governance is actually not diverse. It is overwhelmingly occupied by older people of a certain demographic. And you actually don't need, and this is my challenge to you, let's not always ask the government to do something. There are things we can do ourselves. Each of you who works in an organization could do a quiet audit of your governance. It's not complicated. You have, what, maybe 15 board members? Take a look at them and say, well, does this match up with the picture of Canada? You could imagine Canada, and I have urged them, could do a voluntary audit of its membership so that we actually know what we are talking about. So those are some things that we need to make sure the government does. There are things that we ourselves can do, and there are opportunities coming out of this crisis.
Terrific. Around 2 weeks ago, Senator, we hosted a webinar that focused on digital service delivery and how a number of frontline organizations, social service organizations, have been, in many ways, have been catapulted online and really scrambling to deliver their services to their members via the internet. And the report spoke, touches on technological capacity of the sector. And we know that there is a fair bit to be done around technological improvements. And of course, this crisis has put that and really shown some cracks in that. What are your thoughts on boosting the technological capacity and the digital capacity of our sector as part of the recovery?
I think that's an excellent point. And if I could be wiser with the context of today and rewrite the report, I would have a bigger chapter on digital platforms for the sector and digital capacity for the sector. But we did allude to it, not directly, but indirectly, in that we said that the sector should have access to the same kind of business advisory programs that the small and medium-sized enterprises do. So SMEs have access to capacity building and technology. They have access to capacity building and marketing. They have access to a range of interventions that the charitable sector does not have. So I think coming out of this crisis, we need to develop a playbook around how do we get from here to there, given the added context of the crisis. So one of the things I would sharpen is we need a centralized, and whether it's provincial or federal or in the hands of organizations like CFC or Imagine Canada, I haven't thought about that far enough, but we need a centralized platform that will help organizations, workers, customers get tuned into this new way of doing business. And that will radically change the business model for charities and not-for-profits. I think businesses are now questioning the need for expensive real estate. People are working from home, and to a large extent, I've heard that things are going, not 100%, but quite well. So people are thinking, maybe this is the new normal. And I would encourage charities not to give up the old normal completely, but to adapt the old normal to the new normal through having a very targeted digital strategy. And that has to be supported by government.
That's terrific. We have another question that's come in. Senator, would you elaborate on where the report is in terms of Senate House approvals and the government response to the report and the process?
So this is the challenging part about the report. We're doing things in a completely different way. Technically speaking, the recommendations of the Senate Charitable Committee, even though they've been released publicly, have not been reviewed by the chamber, have not been voted on, or technically what we need is a motion to approve the report, which then means it gets sent to the government. In this case, it would be a series of line ministers who would get the report. Not only the Minister of Finance, the Minister of CRA, the Minister of Employment, Social Development, the Minister of Canadian Heritage. I mean, the ramifications and the threads in the report across the whole of government are significant. Then they would be given an opportunity to respond to us. But we're doing things a little, because we tabled the report in June, we rose, we went into election mode. A number of the senators on the committee got active on the charities report, urging parliamentarians and urging parties to adopt certain aspects of the report into their platform. We were, I don't think, successful. You play that election again for me, and I'm pretty sure this has opened the door for making, for ensuring that parties think a little bit more clearly about the role of charities and not-for-profits as central to the country, as opposed to as an afterthought, which is what is happening. So I think we have an opportunity and a window that we must open, so that it's not just a window, but a whole front door that is open, let the sunshine in, and partner with government to make sure that we are always considered as a central element of the solution seeking, as opposed to a secondary or even way down the line.
Right. Can I ask you a potentially provocative question?
Watch me, as someone would say.
What should the sector be learning coming out of this crisis? Like, in your mind, what are the lessons emerging already for the sector from this crisis?
I think the lessons that are emerging rapidly are that those charities who were prepared in one way or another to provide services to people in need very quickly have been the most responsive. So let's take Kids Help Phone Line. They have been set up to provide advice and counseling to kids in pain, one way or another. And they were able to ramp up their capacity very, very quickly. Those charities who are already working in an associative network, such as the Food Banks Association, were very quickly able to ramp up their asks and get the response from the government because they were organized. So individual capacity, collective capacity. So I think those are the two lessons that are really clear to me: is readiness, collaboration and association will lead to resilience. So that's the advice I would give to not-for-profits and charities and social impact organizations, is first make sure your house is renovated, and with upgraded water heaters or whatever your house may need. And then make sure your house is not alone on the street. I live on a street with 40 houses, and together we are managing to overcome these difficult times because we are a collective. And I would say that collective spirit that is so natural in the sector. There is, I'm struck by the collectivity and the collaboration of the sector.
Right, that's terrific. And I know we just have a few minutes remaining here. I want to, perhaps wrap on a positive note and put a question to you, and it picks up on one of the recommendations around the home for the sector. and you and I have spoke about this a couple of times, where the nonprofit and charitable sector is an innovation sector. And one of the recommendations is to have a home within the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Industry. Our sector's work is world-renowned. Coming out of this pandemic, Canadians across the country are going to be looking for solutions that support people in more equitable ways. And I know that imagination is one of the hardest things to keep alive right now, but what would your message be to sector professionals and sector leaders about our capability for innovation?
I think I would say to them, there is momentum. Build on that momentum. Don't let things slide back after the crisis to business as yesterday. And that's the biggest challenge. We will all become so occupied with getting our lives back, our work back to the old normal, that we may forget that it is the new normal that we should be preparing for. And the new normal, I think, cries out very loudly for a sustained, broad, in-depth conversation, ongoing conversation with the government and and the role of the sector in providing legislative advice, in providing policy advice, in being the partners in solution and service delivery, and in being on hand around evaluation, because we always forget the evaluation. Most government departments, I think evaluation is sort of forgotten from the cycle. So if
Right.
we have home in government, and it enables, and I have this idea and it's in the report, of an associate deputy minister who has a department of staff, and it connects the various interests of the sector. So let's imagine there's a particular issue in the sports sector, which, by the way, is particularly hampered because sport is not generally recognized as a charitable activity, although certain items are. So maybe sport is a bad idea, but maybe there's the environmental sector. Then it would become the glue that holds the conversation between the sector and the government on site. I think the other reason why a home in government is important, because we must recognize that the sector itself is deeply divided and separated around interests and issues. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity as well to close the divides between us, so that environmental charities are speaking to developmental agencies, are speaking to national charities, because all these things are connected. Nothing exists in a silo. And I think, if anything, this crisis has made us learn that it's just not possible to be single issue as opposed to connecting your interests across the interests of others.
Right. A couple of last questions here. This one slightly provocative, I suppose. Donor advised funds have been controversial for some and for some time. During this pandemic, we're seeing a lot of granting to charities from these funds. Do you agree that this crisis has a heightened importance of the relevance of donor advised funds?
I have never argued that the donor advised fund route is an important route to incentivize charitable giving, and I think that is important. What I have a problem with is the lack of, I would say, accountability for each donor advised fund. And I would argue that every donor advised fund, regardless of who they were set up, must have a minimum disbursement rate. Foundations and charitable organizations have a charitable disbursement rate of 3.5%. And we heard conflicting testimony as to whether this should be increased the same as or not. And that's a different matter. Donor advised funds are not foundations. They are regulated differently. And I think the explosive growth of donor advised funds as a preferred route of charitable donations should make the government aware that charitable money needs to be spent in a way that is transparent and accountable, and that donor advised funds can't languish in a donor advised fund for God knows how many years before a dollar is given out. And I do want to say that for the most part, especially the donor advised funds that are held by community foundations are doing a wonderful job, because the community foundation persona is different from the persona of, let's say, a donor advised fund managed by a financial institution. The persona there is different. So I would say that, you know, I'm personally, it didn't make it into the report, by the way. I was one of many senators, and my ideas didn't reverberate on this one as much as I would have hoped. But we have said in the report that donor advised funds and that payout should be looked at by the advisory committee that the minister has appointed to herself. This is the minister of the CRA.
Wonderful. And last question here. Is there a country where there is a comprehensive policy for the nonprofit and charitable sector that you've been inspired by? And what are some of the elements that make it comprehensive?
Well, it's not comprehensive anywhere. But I will say that our models that we looked at were Australia. Australia has a very similar context such as ours, a young country, you know, borrowing a great deal from the mothership in the UK in terms of parliamentary democracy and other things. They have a charities commission. They have definitions of charity, and they've gone that route. So our definitions of charity are still the four heads of charity, you know, education, religion, relief of poverty, and general charitable purposes. Whereas in Australia, they have an articulated list of 15 heads of charity. Now, we could argue back and forth, is it better to be permissive or to be prescriptive? You know, I think the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. In the US, something I found very interesting is that in the most security sensitive government of the world, the US allows US charities to work with non-qualified donees overseas as long as certain due diligence platforms are complied to. So, you know, I think that there are bits and pieces from every jurisdiction that we looked at, that if we are going to really upgrade the sector and the laws and the regulations, we could pick and borrow and steal from everyone. And I'll give you one brilliant example from Australia. It's not going to excite politicians, but I hope it's going to excite this room. Australia has a very similar jurisdiction such as ours, provincial, federal, local charities, everyone working together, but they managed to get together and develop common language, which was accepted at all levels of government for accounts. So I know this is not sexy, but imagine as a charity, you are using the same definition for salaries as everyone else in the country. You're not including contract workers because that's not a salary. So they've actually gone through the rather painful process of developing a chart of accounts that then gets plonked into every application with the same interpretation and into every report. So do I hear sighs of relief in the room? So there are small ideas and big ideas that we can borrow from.
Terrific. Senator, that was hugely insightful to hear from you and have your reflections on the type of recommendations that matter for sector recovery and upgrading the sector, from human resources to precarious work to technological capacity, giving to non-qualified donees, a home for the sector, and so much more. Thank you so much for making the time. Lots in there for all of us to consider, both for relief and recovery. So with that, I will turn it over back to Jenna. Over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Senator, so much for being here. It's been such a pleasure to hear from you, as Vinod was saying, and just dive into this conversation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Apologize for the technical difficulties up at the beginning, but it's been so great to have you as all part of this chat. As Vinod mentioned, I am responsible for our community here at Future of Good. And one of the ways that allows us to do these webinars and to do this interactive content is through our membership program. So if you are interested in a membership, please check it out on our website. It's $10.99 a month. And we also have free accounts. So if you're interested in just staying informed and keeping up with what Future of Good is doing and the social impact sector, please feel free to click that sign up link right off our homepage. We'd love to have you. And this will be going out to all of you in a recording. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for supporting membership. Thank you to our members who attended and anyone else who's interested in being a member. I'm going to, when I send out the information on the webinar today, I'll also include the contact details for the Senator. I know that she's interested in any innovations or anything that you're up to. So if there's anything there that needs additional support, please feel free to reach out to the Senator and we'll send that information along. So thank you everyone for being here, and we will connect with you shortly. Have a great day.